Hello, we're live and welcome to Dive into World Building. And today we're talking about aging, which was a suggestion from someone helpful. I believe it was just last week. Anyway, I think this is actually a really good topic to take up, in part because you don't see that many older people necessarily in genre pieces, and they tend to be reduced to stereotypes a lot, so let's not.
Yeah.
As a general rule, we're going to start with let's not stereotype this group of people we're about to talk about. Yay.
I can actually jump right into that if it's okay.
Sure.
I think part of the problem with one of the reasons that we come up with these stereotypes is that they show up is that aging is a process, and it's not, you don't have children who are always children. You don't have old people who have always been old people. You don't have middle-aged people who have always been middle-aged people who also don't necessarily show up a lot.
Yeah.
It's a process. And if you don't acknowledge that process, then you don't see the people changing and growing from being children that appear in children's books, or teenagers that appear in young adult books, or the age group that appears in any given group, growing into people who are older, who have experienced things, whose minds have been changed or set, who are getting used to being able to do more or less, depending on whether they're looking at, they can do more of, they can do more of a particular thing that requires a mental skill that they've been developing, but less of something that requires a physical skill, or more of the physical because they've been training, or
I'm gonna actually dissent with that. I think that in genre, whether it's fantasy or science fiction, we do show growth to an extent in the kinds of stories that are about quests and people changing and evolving, but we do it in a much more restricted subset of age, where we do a lot of coming of age stories. We do maturing into young adulthood, or we do maturing from young adulthood into sort of a more mature adulthood, and then he became king. And we don't do much that gets into older processes. And I think that's actually not so much that we're not dealing with growth, is that I think a lot of our authors have mostly started off very young, and that we the perception of the genre fiction reader was that they were on the young side, and that even as our grandmasters and people have been aging, they've been writing in the sandboxes they created when they were younger adults, and so we don't have as many stories about aging, which is why I find, for instance, McCaffrey writing about Robinson and Robinson becoming much older and on in through the series really interesting, because we actually get a bit of insight into him, but we are always getting the insight, or often getting the insight of older characters from the eyes of younger people who were children or something when they first encountered this person as a mature adult, and now they're dealing with the grief of letting somebody older go. And I don't think we have as many actually aging protagonists. Bujold is doing a little bit in her stories with her characters aging, but again, we're dealing a lot with the younger generation dealing with how the older generation is getting old. And I think we don't talk about what makes it. We talk about sometimes a little bit about how science fiction or fantasy changes childhood. What does it mean to be a child in this environment? But I don't think we talk as much about what does it mean to be old in that environment.
Yeah, I don't think we do see that. Shoot, there was something else.
Well, I don't actually think you guys were disagreeing with each other at all. I think that what Morgan was probably saying was that we don't typically land with an older person and then see their arc or their change so much as we, you know, as so much as exactly what you're saying, Kat, that we're talking about, that the older people tend to be more static or seen through other people's eyes, or we tend to look at a lot of changes that are happening in the earlier parts of people's lives. So, I mean, people can still change.
Well, no, I don't think that it's not that we're not showing them changing. I think that we're not showing them as viewpoint characters as much. And so
that's
the ways we're talking about the change are about, oh, I see so-and-so has gotten gray. And it's not about, you know, if you're living in a science fiction world, are you still living in that world where you're creaky in the morning? And that's not a story I would have written 10 or 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story I'm only barely starting to think about writing now.
Yeah.
And, you know, I really want to read Chip Delaney's story about getting old, but what I get instead is Chip Delaney's Facebook posts about getting old, which is really fascinating, but not necessarily in his fiction.
Yeah. But there's also the issue that there's the perception when you are the person aging. What are the things that make you realize that you've aged or that you are aging? You know, I looked in the mirror and I thought, wow, I feel like there are more gray hairs than there were. And, you know, mostly I only feel like I'm getting older when I'm doing physical stuff and, you know, even when I'm not in recovery mode. I'm getting short of breath the way I didn't used to, or I creak in places that I didn't used to. But if I'm not looking at myself juxtaposed to a younger self or to younger others, I won't have that I am older than, or I am getting older than myself perception. I'm just an age. I'm myself. I'm not old or young or middle-aged.
Well, yeah, I mean, so we don't always step back from our own life arc to say, oh, look, things are happening.
I'm snickering because I'm very aware of my age right now in ways that strangers who encounter me necessarily aren't. I get routinely assumed to be 20 plus years younger than I actually am. And so I'm acutely aware of the fact that I'm not that 20 something that they think I am. And that, and I'm also really clear that there was that thing that I found really obnoxious when I was younger, where older people than me were like, oh, no, you'll be more certain of yourself when you're older. And I have a memory of myself being pretty damn cocky when I was young. But there's a certain joyful immovability in being able to say, no, really, this isn't conjecture on my part. I actually do know that this is me after X many years, or no, I've seen that thing over and over again over the years, and here's that cycle again. Or, oh God, no, really, your 80s costume is not really what it should be because I was there the first time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of want to know whether in a science fiction setting, whether somebody wants to talk about the trends that they saw when they were young, and oh, look, everybody thinks the Mark IV blaster is so cool now. and I haven't read that story yet, and I don't want to have to write that because I'm not ready to write it yet.
Yeah.
But I want someone else to write it. And I'm like, we have really, really aging grandmasters, and I want to see their stories of who they are now and their experience of the world, and them extrapolating that into, rather than writing more 20, 30, 40 something lantern-jawed heroes. So
lantern-jawed.
I could live with not ever seeing another lantern-jawed hero myself, but
I'm perhaps unfairly projecting what other people might be writing. because I'm not actually reading the things because I haven't been told, oh my, you have to read this, it's exciting.
Square-jawed hero. The lantern jaw, and you're going to hate me for saying this, is how Lovecraft looked. It's that weird face. Yeah, he had a weird face. Weird face. And that's what a lantern jaw is.
Okay, then.
So if you got a lantern jaw, you're a little weird looking. I'm sorry, that's mean, but it's kind of true also. So.
Okay.
Oh, I love this. So I've gone and looked at Collins online, and a projecting lower jaw or long, thin jaws with sunken cheeks that give the face a lean, gaunt appearance, which would be Mr. Lovecraft there.
Mm-hmm.
From the resemblance to the early lantern with long sides and a thin concave horn.
Oh, there you go.
Today we've all learned.
We learned a thing. Thanks for putting us on that little track there, Jay.
On the other hand, I mean, you know, I'm looking here, and they're describing people as having lantern jaws, and like they're talking about Depardieu, and they're saying,
I think it's commonly
Bruce Willis and Sylvester Stallone.
And... no, that's. No.
I think what it's doing is it's a misuse that's becoming so common that it's starting to mean a different thing.
So the other thing is that TV Tropes has a thing called the lantern jaw of justice.
Oh no! What?
Oh yes.
See, I learned. Okay, off topic. I learned my lantern jaws in art history class with portraits of slightly inbred nobility.
Yeah. So I'm seeing
Spanish,
here. So TV Tropes claims a square jawline, a protuberant chin, a manly cleft. Somewhere along the line, possibly around Superman's time, artists decided that these, more so than anything else, were the defining features of really heroic or really strong and dumb characters. Perhaps to an even greater extent than broad shoulders, barrel chest, and absurdly large biceps. The surest sign of a character's strength and manliness lies in his chin.
Dang. Well, it seems like it's. I think it's gravitated. But
it apparently has
back to the topic of aging.
So what do we use?
I'm going to tell you a story.
Okay.
About one time, and I think I've told you this story before, but it is relevant to the aging question. One time, I was over at the home of an elderly friend, and at the time, I believe she was about 92. And I used the word. I was mentioning that my kids liked a book called Yummy Yucky. And these were words that she had never learned. And I thought to myself, wow, I didn't know that. So one of the things that happens over the course of long periods of time, I mean, sometimes it happens more quickly, in fact, but it certainly happens over long periods of time, is language change, right? And that is something that I hardly ever see addressed when you get older characters, right? I mean, sometimes when you're talking about a real world situation, you'll get certain kinds of generational disengagement with language use. But yeah, I hardly ever see that. It'd be so interesting. And I think, in fact, it relates in some sense to the way that people have observed that in science fiction, there isn't usually science fiction. There's less of a sense that there's a sort of a static sense of our technology level now. Maybe there's like, well, here's what we're innovating on in our tech. But yeah, I'm not sure that I see a lot of speculation about the future in science fiction. And I don't see a lot of language change over long periods of time happening in most science fiction.
I tend to choose against those parameters, so, or choose for the parameters you're talking about. So I probably have an atypical list, and
Yay!
Of course, now that I've said that, I'm trying to go, what do I have as counterexamples? And I'm
Yeah.
Counterexample
not
me,
being as
because I want to see this.
I'll have to think about this for a moment. But I do think we do have the trope of sort of aging characters speaking to the young people as the magical old person.
Mm-hmm.
I think we also get some stories about the sort of aging mad scientist trying to achieve immortality and doing wacky things as one of the tropes of aging in genre that I
Yes.
think is. I'm not sure how much more new ground there is to be found there, although somebody will do something revolutionary and then win many awards, I hope. But I kind of want to see, because I've been hearing this from friends who have other reasons to be exploring this idea, the idea that somebody has not undergone some kind of life-changing scientific alteration to their lives and are now sort of looking back and wondering what it would have been like if they'd done it earlier. We don't.
Like what? Do you have an example of what you're talking about?
Well, I mean, there are certain things that I don't want to get into the specifics of the thing I was thinking of, but I'm also thinking of things like my friends who've gotten hip replacements. Every single one of them says, "Oh my God, this made my life so much better. I wish I'd done this earlier." And there are reasons why they didn't, but the range of possibility for what could happen to a character in a science fictional or fantasy milieu, the way they could have become very different is huge.
Yeah.
And sort of wanting them to explore that possibly from the perspective of age and, having chosen one path and thinking about another one. Or I guess we have genres that are very focused on quests and activity, and I want more contemplation.
Yeah. I just thought of a story that's really interesting that's related to this, and it's by Damon Knight. So it's quite an old story. It's called The Dying Man. You guys heard of this story?
No.
It basically it takes place in a world where everybody has been rendered immortal. And then one day a guy starts aging. And nobody can quite figure out why or how to stop it. And so he ends up, dying over the course of the story. That is a pretty interesting thing. Now, it's not so much about the details of how he ages so much as what it is like to age when nobody else is aging around you. And what that gives you, like the kind of, I don't know, it seems like in that story, there was a kind of philosophical depth and seriousness that this dying fellow had that nobody else had, because they were just all sort of these immortal hedonists. And I'm not sure, in fact, that's what would happen if you had it a real life. But, this is speculative fiction, so it could be, it's just, it was what it was. Anyway, it was a very interesting story. I mean, gosh, there's some really neat old people. I was actually quite impressed with Moana's grandmother.
Yeah.
I thought she was a lovely character and a really interesting person.
Sorry, who was that?
Moana's grandmother?
I
haven't watched that.
The other place where we see a lot of aging is, in fact, stories intended for children. Because people like to bring in grandparents, and also fairy tales have a lot to do with aging, and it's a thing that we've sort of lost in more modern genres. I think there's been some more literary fiction with aging as well these days, but I don't know whether this is a bias in publishing on the editorial end or the writer's end, but I want to see more aging stories simply because I think that it's better for us to have a spectrum of humanity. But I think the temptation is to write yet another Citizen Kane aging deathbed regrets story.
Yeah.
And I don't know that we need more of those. I really want to read sort of aging with grace stories or aging without grace, and
If you look,
stories about generational fighting that aren't grounded in the young to middle-aged generation or the youngest generation. I want to read aging stories that start, have a little more emphasis on the patriarch or matriarch or the gender non-binary arc.
I would like to see stories
being cranky.
Yeah, I would like to see stories that don't have the older people, the elderly people representing not so much their generation as
stodginess, old-fashionedness,
stuck in their ways. The people who need to be waited out, the people who are prejudiced and bigoted against human beings for being human beings. The whole the whole idea that oh well, they don't like Black people or gay people or whatever because of the generation they were born in is it's
stale.
Dismissive of it's dismissive of the people who were not ahead of their time because they saw human beings as human beings.
I think we have a tendency to assume generational characters, and I don't know how much of that is because we've been naming our generations in the West, and how much of that is because we educate in cohorts. Mm-hmm. But young people and old people all have a very, I hate to use that Americanism of emphasizing and saying very diverse, but the diversity is there. I think we have I hate using the word lazy because I've been trying to cut it out of my repertoire, but I think it is a kind of laziness to not acknowledge the diversity there. And I notice that in the ways that I want our genre to be forging the path and leading ways for us to learn to talk to each other, I think the more we acknowledge that there's a diversity of attitudes that transcends age, would be a better thing to have shown. Yes. I think we tend to assume it in our own struggles in the community.
Yeah, diversity of attitude, diversity of or variations, attitudes and abilities as well. Because if you look at my mother, who is 83, I think. And well, not now, but my sister-in-law, who was 20 years younger, I think. If someone were to look at the two of them when they were both alive, my mother is alive, my sister-in-law is not, and said which one of these women is older, pretty sure most people would have picked my sister-in-law as the older one, because physical appearance is one of the ways that we mark age. That we look and say, okay, you look of this, this old.
But that varies widely on the basis of life experience and also on the basis of ethnic groups and all that kind of stuff. I can see Kat grinning over there.
See, that knowledge that it differs in those ways and health and all is why I can look at somebody and say, I have no freaking idea how old you are. You could be my age, you could be 10 years younger, you could be 50 years older. You're probably not 60 years older because you'd be dead. But, then probably anyway.
The other thing that I'm finding interesting, just to bring this back to the way we in 2018 are thinking about this, is that we have this idea that, our elderly, and I'm using that word specifically, they've been through so much and they don't really understand new technology and they don't understand phones and all these other things. And then I'm looking at my single digit age children and their peers, and there are things that they don't understand or that they take for granted. And I'm realizing that I know about things that are the modern equivalent of buggy whips.
Yes.
We've talked about this in other points, but corded phones, LP records.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. My dad
transistors
is he's unusual. I know he's unusual because he's an engineer and he was a computer engineer in a day when they were big room-sized things that could add two numbers together if you like coax them through.
Ran a bunch of cards through them.
Yeah. He's 85, I think. So he was a graduate student at MIT when they had all of those room-sized computers. So he's been from there as an adult, working from there to where he's got a smartphone.
Mm-hmm.
And, he's 85. He's not losing his marbles. He's got everything together. So he can work his email and his VCR and all of that stuff. He does not have the technological issues that people tend to ascribe to.
Well, I think that there's that thing where people say you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And I think, in fact, you can, but the dog has to want to learn the new trick. Right?
Well, it also, I believe, there are studies that show that it takes more learning cycles as you get older to learn new things. And I know
tried teaching a toddler something recently.
I have never taught a toddler anything, but I know my mom was a teacher for years, and she's like, it's like 8 learning cycles for, she was in like grade school, 3rd, 4th, second, 3rd, 4th, 5th, etc. So,
how much of those studies take into account the "do I care if I learn this" thing? Because honest to God, our elderly dog, he could not have cared less about learning. Sit. He would go straight from standing to lying down because sit in the middle is like, do I have to? Do I care? No, I don't care. I'm going to lie down and you'll give me a cookie and I'll be.
Well, so here's something that has been sort of bubbling up in my mind as I'm listening to what we've been talking about so far. As people get older, sometimes they will start having health problems, and there's sort of this window of years, of decades, when if people are going to get some of these most serious health conditions, they will tend to get them between the ages of 60 and 80. But if you can get past 85, then you have a much better chance of making it to 100, for example. So that's a piece of it. The other piece of it is that when you're not well, you tend not to go out. And I think, in fact, that we also have these, we also have certain kinds of cultural expectations about the movement and behavior of older people, that we tend to kind of confine them a bit.
Mm-hmm.
The result of that being that you are not going to see as many older people as maybe you should, and that might contribute to the stereotyping.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think we have tropes about what aging looks like, and I'm remembering, I think it was Bujold talking about the difference between somebody of a certain number of years in one sort of society versus another. I think it was Beta versus the back hills of Barayar, and how aging is very much relative to the societies of each of her characters.
Mm-hmm.
And expectations of what it meant to be old, and whether or not you were supposed to be discarded at a certain age or venerated. So I think that as we're doing world building, it's interesting to sort of not assume that every culture has the same constructs for what is and is not how one ages.
Infrastructure is important here too, if you think about it. Just the physical. My folks would love to continue going to the theater. They can't drive at night.
Yeah.
So because of where they live, they can't get to the theater with the infrastructure that exists. The public transportation, if they want to take a cab, that's kind of pricey. You know, cab or Uber, it's not really an option. So if the infrastructure doesn't support the movement of people who can't engage the way they used to, just because they can't drive, and it's very similar to the reasons that you don't see certain types of disabilities,
Right.
because the infrastructure doesn't support the movement of those people.
Yep.
And then there's also, I mean, you're talking about like mobility, where there are like at a certain age you kind of do need to hang up that driver's license, but everyone is loath to, because that's, at least here, one of the only ways to get around.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. If they lived in the city, if they lived in Manhattan, they'd be at concerts and shows all the time. Except that they would live in Manhattan, it would make them crazy. Well, I don't know, maybe not. They grew up in Brooklyn.
Right. So I want to talk about how genre fiction does and doesn't apply in those particular cases of infrastructure and everything else, and whether or not the world that you've built has that accommodation is one of those things that I think as younger writers we might not be considering. What does that world that we've built imply about people's access who are not of that sort of classically able-bodied, normative, et cetera, character that we have, or are not marginalized in this specific ways that the character we've written is marginalized? And who are they encountering? And are all of the side cast all of a certain mold, or are they all able-bodied? Are they all young? Are they all this, or are they all that? And why? And so we have created cultures right now where we mostly have nuclear families. We have people living away from their older generations or younger generations, and we're used to going about in a bubble of people mostly our own age, and sort of marveling when we have people who are not our own age around. Because of the work I'm doing now, I get reached out to by people very much outside of my little cohort, and it's really interesting hearing what is the experience of somebody older than me, that I have sometimes locked in my head what 20 years older than me looks like and sounds like based on when I first started encountering people like that and hanging out with them, but I haven't aged them up as I've aged myself up. And so what has sometimes happened is that my headspace for people my age has shifted up with my age, but I've forgotten to think that they are also that much older now. So on the other hand, culturally right now our things move our culture moves very fast, and so it's relevant. I'm not sure that in other cultures that we would construct the same parameters would apply.
So what could we do to change that up?
Well, I mean, what do we want to do?
Well, I don't know. I mean, let's play around a little bit.
So, I mean, how often does age become an issue in how we're describing our characters? I'm having a really interesting time right now because I'm trying not to use Earth-based time measurements. And so I'm really struggling to describe characters as their familial relationships. And I do have a bit of a generational structure built into the story I'm telling. because I'm telling a refugee immigrant story in one of my big worlds. And so I am paralleling some of the stories that are generalizable among human immigrants here in the 20th and 21st centuries. But I also don't actually have to do that because I'm writing about aliens. And trying to decide whether aliens had generations was a big consideration.
Yeah.
And also, what did it mean when there was aging going on? And what did coming of age mean for an alien? And what did it mean for characters to be aging? And I may just go back and pick up Tolkien and think about his aging elves or his not aging elves, because he did write about this, but we don't focus on that part because we're mostly focused on the shiny and the big battle and there goes the ring.
Well, yeah. So I think it's worth asking, what characteristics do people elect as salient to indicate age? Right? Because gray hair is one of the things that we tend to use around here.
Wrinkle.
But it varies so incredibly widely, right? I mean, you've got people who've got gray hair at age 30, and then you've got other people who are just getting gray hair at age 65, right? So, you know, and then you have all the people who dye their hair for any number of reasons. And then, of course, there's wrinkling. So you could, like, I mean, when you're dealing with aliens, you can do all sorts of stuff. You know, you could go with long in the tooth.
I want to know whether anybody has written a world where young people are artificially aging themselves, because instead of having a youth culture, we have a senescence culture or an aging culture. I can't think of one, but I don't promise to have found it if it was out there.
The thing is that, and this is sort of sidebar, maybe, I don't know. It's not so much, I mean, yeah, it's a youth culture, but it's a particular phase, because if you're 14, a lot of 14-year-olds will go to great lengths to look 18 or 21.
Aspirational aging.
That whole, you know, if you're 29, you are 29 forever, for as long as you can get away with being 29. There's this range, and I think that maybe the group that is depicted by default in some groups, in some genres. You know, if your hero is in his 30s, he's a little on the old side.
Yeah. It's this sort of cultural age default.
Yeah.
Window, I guess.
I got that comment once. I asked a friend to read my book Tea Times 3, and it has, I think the oldest character in there was 70 or 80 something, and then the youngest one was 16, and it was a book about a town, so it had multiple points of view. But most of the characters were in like their 30s and 40s. And my friend read it, and he got back to me, and he's like, "Why is everyone so old?" And I was like, "Dude, they're our age. They are our age. How are you saying this?"
Well, I just want to point out how old Sean Connery and Roger Moore were when they were playing Bond. And, you know, in the real world, those agents wouldn't be that old. And yet, and I note that as I've gotten older, I look at the people who are supposed to be the getting things done characters, and I do find myself having a slight tendency. This is how I know I've gotten older. I'm like, what do you mean they're only 20 something and how can they possibly know enough to do anything with it? And it's just, that is not a thought I had when I was that age. I assumed we knew everything we needed. But you know, I think thinking about how old is the age of maturity in your world is an interesting thing to consider.
Yeah.
And how old are people expected to get, and what happens as they get older, and do they actually age in the ways that contemporary people right now seem to be aging, and what do you as the writer know about contemporary aging anyway?
And also, I think it's given that we're asking these questions, we should also ask, how do these expectations vary across social groups? Because you know, if you have poor people versus rich people, and or vastly differential access to healthcare, you're going to see very, very big differences in who gets to be old, right?
And who gets to retire and live, you know, as an old person without working themselves to death.
Right.
And what kind of work you get to do is very much a class thing.
I mean, we always talk about like how the Queen Mother and the Queen are aging so gracefully. They have, you know, they have the ultimate access to comfort and healthcare, so that helps a lot, right?
I know, there was a joke about that in 30 Rock where Jack tells Liz something about like 60. Oh god, oh dang it, I can't remember. I'm sorry. Crap. It was just basically that, like, yeah, rich 40 or rich 50 is basically like poor people 20 or something, right? It was it really was like, it was just literally like that. It's like, yeah, for real.
I mean, so like to take the Varan example, because I always have that in my back pocket. Whether, you know, how many old people are around is going to depend a lot on what caste you're a member of. And it doesn't always pattern the way that you might expect, because yes, there are lower caste groups that have more difficulty accessing things like healthcare, but also the nobility is incredibly inbred. And so even though they have really great healthcare, there aren't that many really old people among the highest caste.
I've also been looking at a friend is posting pictures from his family from a generation and 2 generations ago, and wow, you know, women who are the age I am right now, they look really old in their photos, and it's partly how they conduct themselves, but
yeah,
our ideas of what an age looks like, I think, are evolving again.
Well,
but
and
I
think that there's also different kinds of cultural views on things like sun exposure.
Well, not just sun exposure, but I'm looking, and I have a friend who I went to high school with, and when I look at pictures of her, she looks like she's 12, 15, 20 years older than me now. And part of it is the graying, and part of it is, I think, the societal grooming expectations around her. Code to me is much older.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And I because she's in a very different place than I am. I went to a boarding school, so people came from all over, and there are people in my cohort that I look at and they look younger than I am because they've done less aging. And I'm really clear that there was a period in my life where it was like Dorian Gray. I suddenly went from being relatively ageless to suddenly acquiring a huge number of years from stress. And so I ended up going back to, one of the Poe stories has somebody going through a maelstrom and suddenly ending up with his hair like going shocking white. And thinking about, we have told some stories, I think, in our speculation in I think, Twilight Zone and other stories like that, of people suddenly aging and the shock that they face when they wake up aged.
You know, I have to. What you're saying is reminding me that I should really mention Howl's Moving Castle.
Yes, yes.
Because Sophie spends a great deal of time in that film. At least I confess I haven't read the book, but in the film she spends a great deal of time being, you know, quite aged.
Yeah, that's in the book too. It's the book is vastly different though, but yeah.
So I understand.
Book, yeah, she's like old and crickety, and is like kind of like, oh god, stuff is so hard. Like just walking places get real hard.
Mm-hmm. Well, very cool.
Anyway, I suddenly want to write a world where I want to write a race where the mobility becomes easier and easier as you get older, because maybe you're some kind of reptile person or something that
that's cool,
that acquires more joints or something as you get older, and it becomes easier to move.
It's because your bones dissolve, but
sure, I think we can brainstorm.
Like anything with tentacles.
I think that we could definitely brainstorm many different reasons why, and that aging would work really differently in an alien race and construct. And I'm not going to write that right now because I have a lot of other things to write, but I guess I hope somebody else writes it for me so that I can read it.
And that won't preclude you writing it later if you have the time and inclination. So,
yeah.
Well, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I wanted to cover on the topic of aging.
Well, I don't think anybody has mentioned the concept of elders.
Yeah,
and I don't consider myself an expert on it by any stretch, but that's something that I think is worth pointing people at as a sort of a vein of research. Is the indigenous peoples and their varying ideas of the role of older people in society, I guess would be what I would say. You know, since I'm down to 1 minute and can't really discuss it.
Any society that any society that doesn't discard its elderly once they are not.
I strongly encourage people not to exoticize Indigenous cultures about that.
Okay.
It is true that there is a lot of respect for elders in Indigenous societies, but that's not the only place where that exists. And I think that we have a tendency to normalize the way that we have a youth-obsessed and elder-discarding culture. And I don't think that what we have is actually normal or sustainable. So,
yeah, I mean, part of the problem that we have is that we see people as productive members of society, and if you have a society where you have to produce a thing or produce food or produce money, then your words and your experience, if they're not applicable to making money in a capitalist group, you're not going to have elders that are valued. You're going to have them discarded once they can't produce.
We have a culture of presentism and a lot of disregard for precedent and sustainability and for wisdom and accrued experience. And in some ways it's powerful in that whole, why do we have to do it? Because we've always done it that way. But it also leads us to willy-nilly throwing over things and then finding out later that we've done something catastrophic. So I think that's one of the classic stories that genre fiction ought to be exploring, that it doesn't do nearly as often as it should.
Yeah.
And what happens when you have a majority aging culture? And
well, we haven't even talked about aging cultures. Like,
I know, because we're heading like
America's starting to be an aging culture. Japan's been dealing with it for a while.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the graying of fandom.
The graying of fandom is a thing. Yeah.
Sorry. That
No,
was
I mean,
naughty.
so there's more that we could talk about. Always.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was possibly me throwing golden apples into the end of the conversation. Yeah, I also have stories right now that I am writing that I hadn't thought of them as aging stories, but I'm writing a story about mourning for technology that was in the context of a more advanced into climate change world, and what do we gain and lose in that world.
Mm.
But I guess that's an aging story.
Yeah.
And on that morose note,
well, I mean, there are also elements of questions of aging in the persistence of blood, where I have, you know, the couple where the wife's only 35 but has already had 5 children and become disabled as a result, and so she thinks of herself as older than she is, and then the husband who, you know, dies at age 60, and so there are discussions of age in that story because it's relevant to the characters, you know, independently of their actual chronological age.
we haven't even talked about what happens in a culture where you don't have physicality and possibly the aging of gametes as your major factors for mate selection or productivity or value. What happens in that culture? Does that subvert who is valued and who isn't? Because right now we've got issues of what happens when the parents are aging and what happens when your partner isn't physically capable.
Mm-hmm.
What happens in a magical or science fictional future where that's not a consideration?
Well, maybe we should in a future hangout talk about the parameters that we use to decide whether people are valued.
Ooh.
Yeah, that could get interesting.
Any chance we could schedule an extra hour for that?
Yeah.
That
Well,
seems like
I mean, there are plenty of topics where we just sort of have to get a start on it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Say, okay, should we do this again? So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I've written that down as a possible topic. In any case, we are now at 5:04, so I'm going to stop the broadcast. We, I believe, will be meeting next week as usual. I'm working on guests for next month, and we'll see what I can come up with. But I will get back to you on that. And thank you all for coming and for all of your helpful contributions.